Welcome to In Focus with Ijaz Haider. We kick off this evening's program with a discussion of how Taliban will deal with media freedoms and women's rights. The signals are better than the last time Taliban were in Kabul, but they aren't enough. Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid has stated that women can be part of the workforce, but they must abide by the rules of Sharia. This is a vague statement since Sharia is not codified and different schools have different interpretations of how it works. In the previous incarnation, Taliban's idea of women's place was extremely regressive. They need to explain what their interpretation of Sharia this time round is. This is not the 90s. In the last 20 years, have seen Afghan women in the urban centers at least play a significant role in the social, economic and political affairs of that country. Media freedoms is another concern. Last Tuesday, Mujahid spoke about Taliban's idea of how the media should work. He said Taliban want all media outlets to continue their activities, but they have three suggestions. No broadcast should contradict Islamic values, reports should be impartial, and no one should broadcast anything that goes against the national interest. Once again, all these categories are vague and depend on how the Taliban interpret Islamic values, what they would consider impartial, and how they would define national interest. But let's dive into our discussion this evening. I'm joined by Sara Kazemi, founder of World Orphanage Foundation, an NGO based in Los Angeles with a branch in Afghanistan, Shadi Khan Saif, international correspondent for Reuters covering the war in Afghanistan, and Dr. Ilhan Niaz, Associate Professor of History at Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and award-winning author. Let me begin with Ms. Kazemi. So, Ms. Kazemi, as I said, the signals are certainly better than what we witnessed in the 90s, but the statements are clearly vague, and it will obviously depend on how the Taliban, as I said in my opening, would interpret Islamic values or national interest or impartiality. So give me your sense, and I believe you were in Kabul until about a couple of weeks ago, and you've been working there for a long time. So give me your sense of what you think is positive and what should still concern us.
Sure. Being an Afghan American and working in Afghanistan in ground myself for past 11 years, helping women, just World Orphanage Foundation, the base of it is women empowerment, women education, helping adoption with orphans, and myself, I've been helping kids for past 11 years. Now, with Taliban having a say with the media, freedom of media, we have to understand that up to right now, Taliban are not still they're in ground, but they've not formed their law. So this vague information will be out there, and so many different type of information will be revealed to public. One of the main issue is the fear of the people have a lot of fear lately, and it's all because of how the media is moving forward. Just myself, I got to U.S. about 11 to 12 days ago. Taliban reached out to me and they said, we know you're very active and we understand that you are Afghan American, but some of the basic things that we would like for you to do is how you approach, how you dress up. We see you're active around Kabul, you drive yourself around. So each individual is going to approach media saying something different about what the laws of what the current laws in ground for Afghanistan media women is, and currently we are very unsure of how are they planning to take the economy of Afghanistan, the media rights of Afghanistan, the women such as myself working in Afghanistan. We don't know. We just have to be very patient because all type of false information will be delivered to all kinds of media around the world. So we have to, I believe, be patient to see how we're going to, what the future holds.
Okay. Now, what I find really interesting, and also I think it's a major positive, is for the Taliban to have approached you. So clearly, they know of you, about you, and the work that you have done, and they would want to utilize your expertise. I am assuming that that is something they would also want from a number of other women and men, educated professionals, to continue. And they've actually stated, I mean, they've said, they've asked the United States not to create panic and not to get people out of Afghanistan. And they've been saying to the professionals to stay put and work for Afghanistan. Now, is that something you think provides the space for Afghans to stay put and actually work for Afghanistan?
Being an Afghan myself, if I don't build my country, 30 years ago, I became a refugee, and we had to move to USA. So I built myself. If I don't build my nation, who is going to build Afghanistan? Are we always going to have to depend on international outreach program for them to come and build Afghanistan? Right now, the panic is created by the people. And that is one of the major issues, because being in ground myself, I just see people are panicking. And despite a lot of explosion did happen in the past, in past 1 year, I've literally seen rockets going about 50 feet across a building. And 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I've seen a bus explode about probably 200 feet from where I was in Kabul. So right now, today, we have to be calm. We have to be patient. And what United States is doing, I believe from the humanitarian aspects of it, okay, we are going to flee 100,000, 300,000 out of the country. What about the next 38 million? So if it comes down to humanity, so 100,000, they have the human rights, or 300,000, and 38 million, they don't have the human rights. So if we're going to create something, and if we're going to flee people out of this country, we have to have a strategic planning, because when I start looking at the media upon my arrival, people are getting into these airplanes without a mask, without any COVID test, without proper documentation. In the very beginning, there was nobody had any paperwork. They would just put people in the airplane. And there are so many people that I know today, they're in San Francisco. And when I reach out to them and I ask, how did you get here? Since you had no passport, no test card, no identification, and they're in here. So how do we know that we are not going to flee a different type of group, a different type of entity into United States, being a U.S. citizen? So it's very critical. How everything is going is chaos.
Let me ask you a final question. You've given us some really very interesting insights, and I'm grateful to you for that. Will you be going back and working for Afghanistan?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And my request from the international organization and from the neighboring country is, right now, Afghanistan is going through economical issues. The banking sector have sanctioned. All the borders are closed. So there is no trade that's happening. We will definitely need our neighbor country to at least open up the trade sector or come to communication with
some border crossings,
Taliban.
Some border crossings have been opened, but I think a lot of this will also depend on how the internal situation gets stabilized. But thank you so much, Sara Kazemi, for your insights. I suspect we will be, utilizing your expertise and your enthusiasm for working for your country in future also. But really grateful. Let me pull in Shadi Khan Saif. But before that, Sara Kazemi talked about money. And in a recent op-ed, Ajmal Ahmadi, who's the former central bank governor, he talked about the fact that international community, instead of stopping the funding, must go on and release the funds, because otherwise, the Afghanistan economy, I mean, the prices of essential commodities have already doubled, trebled. So that op-ed basically says, stop with this sanctions thing and work towards the betterment of the overall betterment of Afghans in Afghanistan. Shadi Khan Saif, you've obviously been covering Afghanistan for a very long time. Give me your sense of how you look at the signaling coming from the Taliban. Do you find that there's a difference between what we saw in the 90s and what we're witnessing now? What are the positives? What are the negatives?
The signals are, as you said, different, but of course not enough. The signals are coming good, but the thing that we have to realize is that the new setup, the new force in power in Afghanistan, the Taliban, they desperately need international recognition, and they seem to realize that they needed to establish some sort of functional government in the country. But the ground reality is that people are panicking not because of without any reason. There are substantial reasons. The panic on the ground among the young population that is educated and that grew up in the past 2 decades, they have heard a very horrific series of tales from the past rule of the Taliban. So whatever the Taliban leaders might be saying now is absolutely not enough for them to be convinced that their rights and liberties, which are hugely important for this generation, will not be taken away back from them. I've seen young colleagues in the media sector, others in the civil society sector, in the government, in the private, they've all shut their businesses. They've all stopped going out. It's not about the few well-connected or so-called elite who managed to leave the country very safely. It's about the common people, the common, particularly female, who are doing their own businesses. They had nothing to do with the U.S. forces or the U.S. diplomatic mission. They were doing their own businesses. Now all of them, even common workers like tailors and beauty parlor operators, they've all closed down. In Kabul, if you have been there before, and if you go now, it's totally a different city now. So that means that it has been nearly 2 weeks since the Taliban have taken control. They have been so far unable to convince people that they have changed. Certainly their messaging is good, but their actions are perhaps still not enough, and
Shadi Khan Saif, your voice is breaking up. So, before we lose connection with you, I have a quick question, final question to you. Do you think that what you're witnessing now has to do with the sort of the transition and the fear and panic and the rest of it? But do you also expect that in the next 10 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, things will return to normal?
But I don't see anything on the ground. I can be wishful, but I honestly, I don't see any practical reasons. I don't see anything concrete on the ground that convinces me that in the few years to come, the situation might return to normal as far as women and girls and their liberties are concerned, and situation of normalcy is concerned. I hope, but I can be wishful, but I don't see anything really concrete on the ground.
Right. Unless, as I said in my also, the Taliban have to be less vague and more concrete about what they mean by Islamic values and, impartiality and, of course, national interest. So thank you so much. That was Shadi Khan Saif speaking with us. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, you heard two Afghans, one a social activist, the other a journalist covering Afghanistan for many years now. Give me your sense of what you're seeing and how would you interpret it in the short to medium term?
I think what we are seeing is that the Taliban are attempting to consolidate power and attempting to do so in a manner that also secures for their government in the coming years a measure of international recognition that did not enjoy in 1996 to 2001. When it comes to doing this, the Taliban are playing a far smarter media strategy. Their PR has been quite slick over the past couple of weeks. And naturally, the world is very thankful that there hasn't been a bloodbath in terms of the Taliban takeover of Kabul or indeed other major cities. At the same time, I fear that once the Western interest in Afghanistan recedes with the exit of the Western human presence there, then the Taliban will be in a far more strong position in terms of implementing what they would regard as their ideology. What history again teaches us is that extremist organizations or extremist movements, whether of the left or of the right, they do not become more moderate when they succeed in achieving political power or military victories. Rather, they might become a bit more pragmatic while they consolidate power, but once power is consolidated, the original ideologically driven program reasserts itself, often with escalating vengeance upon those that the regime feel are in one way or another undesirable. So I do understand the relief that, let's say, some people might have that there is no immediate upsurge in violence, but we should be extremely skeptical of any pronouncements coming from the Taliban with regard to the future of not only women or minorities or other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, but also with reference to the freedom of all Afghans, including Afghan males, to live their lives as they see fit. So this is, I think, something which we have to be extremely, extremely skeptical about in terms of looking at these pronouncements coming out of the Taliban.
Now, of course, I mean, I'm not going to challenge you on the historical trajectories, and of course, you're absolutely right that the period of consolidation is very different after power has been consolidated. But I was actually struck when Sarah Kazemi said that the Taliban have reached out to her, which means that, and since she's not the only Afghan who has been working in Afghanistan, I'm assuming that, they know people who have been working and they expect their expertise to come in handy and also their international contacts and the rest of it. So does that sound like a positive that could, sort of help in a long way because money is going to be a problem. International recognition is going to be a problem, and money somehow is tied up in many ways with international recognition. Do you think that could perhaps have a salutary impact on the ideological severity?
I think over here, we need to draw a distinction between the Taliban's leadership, which has in many cases been outside of Afghanistan and has also been interacting with other powers, such as reference the Doha process, and the rank and file Taliban, the Taliban commanders who are in the field. So while definitely we are seeing the elite level of the Taliban exhibiting far more sophistication. I don't think that their rank and file are any less committed to the ideology that they espoused in the 1990s, and which in many ways has been vindicated by victory over the most powerful military alliance in human history. So I, again, would caution against having too cheery an outlook regarding a little bit of soft messaging for the Taliban while there's still a large foreign presence. We will know, I think, within a matter of months, once the last foreign contingents leave, what the Taliban actually have in mind in terms of governing their own people. And certainly, maybe the Taliban will buck the trend. You know, they will become one of the extremist regimes to have come to power and then suddenly turn towards moderation. But that does not seem to be very likely in terms of historical experience.
Right. Dr. Niaz, one last question with reference to money. Now, I talked about this op-ed penned by Ajmal Ahmadi, the former governor of Central Bank. Let me read out a couple of excerpts from this. He says, now the country, that's Afghanistan, must also deal with an economic shock with the freezing of $9 billion of foreign reserves. Import coverage has dropped from more than 15 months to only 2 days overnight. Similarly, international aid flows are likewise expected to decline. Germany has already announced a suspension of $300 million in aid, while the IMF has suspended its $450 million SDR allocation. During the G7 meeting this week, it is expected that UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson might call for new sanctions. Now, is this something you think is better avoided, if you will, because obviously it'll have the most impact on the common Afghan. Is this a policy by the West something that should be pushed back against?
Again, what we see is that the West has introduced punishing sanctions against a number of countries a number of times in the past 50, 60 years. We have the example of Iran, we have the example of Cuba, there's the example of North Korea, and there was also the example of Ba'athist Iraq after the first Gulf War. And what we generally see is that when sanctions or other economic restrictions and embargoes are imposed upon a society, the result is that it actually strengthens the regime by imposing a system of economic rationing that greatly increases the importance of political and administrative access to members of that regime. So sanctions, they do punish the ordinary people, but they do not actually diminish the power of the regime. In fact, they appear to actually increase the power of the regime. If, let's say, the West goes ahead and imposes sanctions or freezes Afghanistan's assets, if the World Bank, IMF, and other official development assistance providers pull back from Afghanistan, then the people that are going to be harmed the most are, of course, those Afghans that are working in sectors of the economy that are relatively globalized, that are relatively professionalized, and that are relatively modernized. And that hollowing out of Afghanistan's economy and society, while it might produce contractions in GDP and other problems, will also, I would think, help the Taliban in terms of consolidating power by effectively liquidating their likely opponents in the domestic sphere, in the economic sense of the term.
Right.
So it would be a suicidal step on part of the West if they were to actually do this.
I believe you're right. I mean, I would agree with that. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Ilhan Niaz giving us his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the evolving situation in Afghanistan and the four-nation tour by Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi for consultations. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi is on a four-nation tour for consultations on the situation in Afghanistan, which remains in flux. Taliban are in Kabul. Former President Ashraf Ghani has fled the country. On Sunday, Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid said that talks on the formation of a new government with Afghan political leaders are underway, and a new government will be announced in the near future. As we have earlier reported, 3 prominent Afghan politicians have had several rounds of talks with Taliban representatives. These include former President Hamid Karzai, chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah Abdullah, and Hizb-e-Islami leader Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. To this end, they have put together a transition council to negotiate with Taliban leadership for moving towards the next phase of political settlement. Yesterday, we spoke with Ahmed Wali Masood, younger brother of Ahmed Shah Masood. Mr. Masood was of the view that current consultations in Kabul cannot be described as talks for the future of Afghanistan, since they do not include a number of other stakeholders. To discuss what role Pakistan is playing or can play further in light of Mr. Qureshi's shuttle diplomacy, I'm joined by Ambassador Tamina Janjua, former Foreign Secretary, and Ambassador Zamir Akram, a former career diplomat with long experience of bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. Ambassador Janjua, so what are we looking at now? So at the press conference, Minister Qureshi talked about the fact that he's going to discuss a joint strategy with Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, and also is also going to Iran. So joint strategy to deal with the situation of influx of refugees, probably terrorism, etc., etc. So how exactly is this going to pan out?
It's a very significant and important visit that the Prime Minister is undertaking because of the fact, and it's written out also in the press release that's been issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where it says that neighboring countries have a vital stake in peace, security, and stability of Afghanistan and the region, and that Pakistan intends to closely coordinate with neighbors to address common challenges and advance shared goals of peace, stability, security, and regional connectivity. The idea is that, and there's much that has been said, there are leaders from outside as well who've spoken about the work that has to be done by regional countries. As far as Pakistan is concerned, Pakistan is obviously has played the role of a facilitator earlier on, but now it is the Afghans that have taken control of the situation in Afghanistan, and it is the Afghans that have to decide the future of Afghanistan. For us, as far as the visit is concerned, of course, it's very important to have a regional collective effort so that we can assist whichever government is in Afghanistan to ensure that there is a future beyond the war that has existed in Afghanistan for more than 40 years. The regional response is necessary also because there are the Taliban, if they come into power, if they finally take over the reins of power in Afghanistan, which they appear to do so, they face financial difficulties and these have to be addressed. So it is not just the region, but also the international communities that has to support the efforts of the region countries in trying to find a way out for the people of Afghanistan to have a good future. The people of Afghanistan are the ones who have had a very difficult time, and it's they who have demonstrated through the way the Taliban have gone to various capitals of the regional provinces of their provinces as well as Kabul, i.e. it has been done without shots being fired, and where people have accepted the Taliban coming in because they see in the Taliban the possibility of peace returning to Afghanistan, for peace and stability to return to Afghanistan, and therefore we do need with Uzbekistan, with Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran a coordinated policy. As far as Iran is concerned, Iran is particularly important at this time because we've had positive coordination with the Iranians for a while now on the Afghan issue, and the foreign minister will be the first foreign dignitary to meet the new foreign minister, Abdul Ayan, who will take oath, I think, today and will be meeting the foreign minister tomorrow. So there is a very important, this will be an important visit as well. There has been the new government in Tehran has insisted that they want to concentrate on the neighborhood, and they have also underscored the importance of an inclusive government and peace and stability in Afghanistan. They had difficulties with the U.S. being in the neighborhood. Now that the U.S. has left, it has given the Iranians a degree of geopolitical space, and therefore the Iranians would be willing to play a role within a regional context as well. So the visit is extremely important. Foreign Minister Qureshi had referred to his earlier consultations also with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and therefore it is based and had said that it is the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan that have to help the people of Afghanistan in arriving at a peaceful, stable Afghanistan, which is critical for Pakistan as well and for all the neighbors.
That's a good view of the situation. Now, Ambassador Akram, the problem is that while the regional countries are obviously, because any fallout, they're the ones that are going to be the worst hit, while they're trying to somehow work towards stability in Afghanistan, the West is unfortunately taking actions which are not particularly suited to that end. And I'm quoting from an op-ed by Ajmal Ahmadi, the former central bank governor of Afghanistan. And he says there's been the freezing of $9 billion of foreign reserves. Import coverage has dropped from more than 15 months to only 2 days overnight. Then he's talked about the fact that Germany has already announced a suspension of $300 million in aid, while the IMF has suspended its $440 million SDR allocation. And the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson might call for new sanctions at the G7 meeting. Now, this does not seem like actions that are going to work towards inducing stability. They're going to be not only work against the interests of millions of average Afghans, but also create problems. By that very act, also create problems for regional countries, including Pakistan.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think the Western countries have taken a very negative attitude. I think it's premature for them to take these kind of steps, such as freezing their assets or denying them international loans through the IFIs, or even placing sanctions, because so far the Taliban are in consultations with the other Afghan factions to evolve what we call an inclusive or a broad-based government. And I think that they should be given the space and the time for them to be able to do that. But this kind of preemptive measures by the West will, as you say, prove to be counterproductive and could even lead to greater instability in Afghanistan. And I want to just recall here a lot of the statements that are coming ignore the fact that in the old days, when the Taliban first came into power, it was this precise kind of negative approach and the denial of assistance to the Taliban government at that time that forced them to look for funding elsewhere, and amongst them was Mr. Osama bin Laden's own funding network. So if we push them again in this direction of extremism and looking for other kinds of means of funding and survival for their government, then that would lead to greater instability in the country. But having said that, I think that there is there are now better options than there were the last time around when the Taliban came to power. And by that I mean the presence and the willingness of countries like China, even Russia, to be supportive of the Taliban and the government that we are waiting to emerge, the inclusive government. And I think that would play a very important role in helping the Taliban. And I think the final thing I want to say is that this is also a time when Pakistan should do whatever it can do to help stabilize the economic situation. And there's a shortage of food, there's a need for humanitarian assistance. Those are the kind of things that we can do to the extent that is within our capability. And we should do that immediately. I feel that we should not be waiting for a broad-based or inclusive government to emerge because this need is urgent. This need is now, and we need to be able to try and do that. And if we can do that in concert with other powers like China or Russia, even Iran, that would be helpful to stabilize the situation in Afghanistan. But I think the Western powers that you mentioned are taking a very narrow and a very short-sighted and counterproductive approach, which is going to backfire on them and also on the region.
Well, I absolutely agree with that. We got to step up to the plate. But you'd also agree that, singly, no one regional state can actually, bear the burden of this. So there's got to be a regional response to this kind of situation. And I suspect this might well be on the agenda of the talks when Mr. Qureshi, goes round. But, when you talk about Russia and China, very quickly before I go back to Ambassador Janjua, again, from the same op-ed by Ajmal Ahmadi, he says the assertion that China, Russia, or even Pakistan will invest large sums in Afghanistan is not realistic. In 2019, as Afghanistan's Minister of Commerce, I attended the Second Belt and Road Initiative conference in Beijing. However much we tried, Afghanistan was never part of the BRI, and I would not expect it to be a part of the initiative in the near future. So it seems that Afghanistan will remain dependent on, obviously the release of their foreign exchange reserves and also the IMF funding facility.
Principle, if nothing else, in principle, it is wrong to free Afghanistan's assets, irrespective of who is in power. I think it is their money, and that it should not be frozen by anyone else. So that, in principle, is a wrong step to take. Mr. Ahmadzai knows more, I guess, than obviously anyone else about the economic well-being of the Afghan economy. But I would still say that because the Chinese and the Russians, particularly the Chinese, have already invested quite heavily in Afghanistan's copper and other mineral resources, and they would like to take that forward. Secondly, the Chinese have already also spoken about extending the BRI to Afghanistan and for Afghanistan to be in a sort of an extension of the CPEC. And it's also important to remember that for the Chinese, access through Afghanistan to Iran and Turkey would be a tremendous boost for their BRI project. So all these are factors, and the Chinese know that this is the time that they need to come up and help the Afghans. Yes, I agree that Pakistan by itself isn't able to do much because we are ourselves in a rather difficult economic situation. But as I said, we should do whatever we can in terms of food items, etc., humanitarian assistance, etc. There are a lot of expert doctors and others who are apparently fleeing from Afghanistan. Perhaps we can offer them medical assistance on a temporary basis as well. So, I mean, these are things that need to be discussed with the Taliban leadership as to what we can do. And I think that this is definitely also on the foreign minister's agenda when he visits these immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, as he is doing right now.
Okay. Before I wrap up quickly, Ambassador Janjua, is there anything you want to add to what Ambassador Akram is saying with reference to the role that Pakistan can play? And also, I want to get your view on the freezing of these assets. How do you look at that?
Well, obviously, the freezing of the assets is a totally untimely thing, especially at a time when there is a crisis, an economic crisis that the Afghans are undergoing. The Taliban is under our government, whichever one it comes into power will be undergoing. And it directly affects the people of Afghanistan. One thing one must notice about the Taliban now, they are more nationalistic. They have clearly said that they are here for the people of Afghanistan, for the Afghan future of Afghanistan, and they are not interested in any other issue. And that is what perhaps will particularly hurt the people of Afghanistan, and something that they will be focusing on, I would imagine. The other point that I would like to just make is a question of the evacuations that are taking place. The evacuation has created, the situation of evacuations that we created, and the difficulties that are being demonstrated at the airport have been created by the US itself in making announcements in Kabul that anyone who's interested can come to the airport. And the result is the disaster that all these people are facing. That needs to be addressed immediately. The world is recognizing Pakistan's role in helping on evacuations of their nationals. But this is the time that people have to put pressure on those who are responsible at the airport, at the Kabul airport, to ensure an orderly return or an orderly exit of those who want to go. And I completely agree that this is not a time for professionals to leave, but this is the time for the people of Afghanistan to come together. As they have said, and as I said earlier, this is not a time for Pakistan to make any suggestions or advice. It is for the people of Afghanistan, we're a proud nation, to take decisions on their own and feel the freedom and stability within their own country.
Absolutely. I'm sorry that you talked about the evacuation. That was a very important point. Pakistan International Airlines mounted 7 special flights. And the embassy in Afghanistan has been working round the clock, frankly, in, getting visas for people, foreigners and others who wanted to leave Afghanistan via Pakistan. Thank you so much to Ambassador Janjua. Thank you to Ambassador Akram for his insights. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next week at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.